And so our next step is running output as table, and we're supplying the items, and then we're just going to print out whatever is returned from output as table. Now again, in the previous version of this code, the outputting as a table and the parsing of the data were all part of one function, but this time it's split up into two parts. So let's go ahead and take a look at the output as table function. I'm going to scroll up a little bit here, and here's our function. Output as table takes one parameter, which is an array of a certain structure that gets returned from our parse data file function. Our first step is dealing with what happens if there's actually no data that's being passed through items. So we're using a function called count in order to count the number of items in the array. If it equals 0, it means there's nothing in there. And we're going to return our placeholder text that says, hey, we don't have any data to display. Notice that we're doing this first above the other code, which is a little different than the structure of our last code, where we did it at the end only if we didn't have data to return. By doing this at the top of a function, we can return a value and stop the execution of all the other code in this function. So notice that we have return here, but then after all of this code here, we have another return. Doing something like this is totally fine. It's a great way to check for certain conditions before you run the bulk of your code. So if the number of items is bigger than 0, which it will be in our case, what we're going to do is generate our table. In the first part, we're generating a header for the table, and in the second part, we're generating some table content, and then finally we're pulling it all together in a table. Now again, remember that we don't know exactly what the structure of this data is. We don't know if it has 2 columns or 10 columns or 100 columns, and we don't know what the names of those columns are. So what we're going to do is take one item from our array of items, and we're going to pull out the keys. Now the keys are the actual names of the columns. So when we run for each, the key here is going to be the name of the column, and the value is going to be the value of that column. Now we don't need this value, but we have to use this structure in order to pull out the key. Now notice that we're getting just the first item inside of our items array. Now if you remember, the items array contains each record, and so we're pointing to a specific record here by using the key of 0. And so this value here is an associative array that includes all of the keys that correspond to the labels or column names of our data. So for each item here, we're adding to a string called table heading by using our shorthand concatenation operator here. And we're just taking the heading text and we're wrapping a th or table header tag around it. The first time this for each loop runs, the heading will be name. The next time it runs, it will be birth year, and so on until we have 4 table headings inside of our table heading variable. Once we have those, we need to wrap a table row tag around it. So here we have that being wrapped around the table heading string, and we're assigning that to our th variable here. In this next part, we're getting the content of the table, which is the actual data. Now, one other way we could have done this is by passing an array labels parameter to this output as table, and that would be the same array as we passed to our parsed data file function. But because we know that the key to every piece of data will include those labels, then we would be duplicating information by requiring 2 parameters here. However, using either structure is completely valid, and if you can think of a good use case for this output as table, where the actual labels are going to be different than the labels that are assigned inside of this items array, then it could be a good idea to separate that out into a separate parameter. Okay, so in this next part, once we have the table header, we're generating the table content. So first of all, we're creating an empty string variable called table body, and then we're going to loop through each item inside of the items array. Now again, the value of each one of those is an array itself. And so we're going to have another for each loop that runs through each item array, which is each piece of data, and wraps a table cell around each one. Notice that we're initializing a row variable here, which is just an empty string, and we're adding to this string for each item inside of this item array. Once we have all of the table cells together inside of this row variable, we need to wrap a table row tag around it. So once we've looped through each piece of data inside of the item array variable, PHP will move on to the next line where we add our table row to the table body string here. So by the time we get to this point, this row variable will contain several table cells, each one that's wrapped around a piece of data that's associated with a single record. In our case, there's going to be 4 table cells because there's 4 pieces of data, and then we're going to wrap these table row tags around that and add it to the table body. This will run for each record, and in our case that will be 3, and once the for each loop is over, then what we're going to do is wrap our table tag around it. And this idea should be familiar to you from our previous examples. So what we're doing here is taking the table tag, we're adding the table heading that we generated up here, we're adding the table body, which contains all of the data, and then we're ending the table tag. Finally, we're returning all of this as output. So we go back to the code where we're executing this. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit. We're right here on this line where we're printing out the return value from output as table. Go ahead and make sure that your file is saved, and then let's jump to the browser and take a look at how this is output. So this top table here is the output from what we've explored so far. This next output we're about to talk about. But you can see here that the structure of the output is identical to our previous example when we've worked with this data. But there's 2 differences with this example. The first is that we've separated out the functionality into 2 separate functions. The first, which is supposed to take data from a file and return an array, and the second function, which takes an array and outputs a table. Now we can start to see the power of doing this when we look at other ways to use these functions. So I'm going to jump back to our code here, and let's go ahead and scroll down to the bottom.